Okay folks, here we go with hopefully the example for how we're going to present on our battles. Obviously you can't come here and use the board, but I'm going to show you the types of things you have to talk about. Here's mine. First major battle is Battle of Manassas. Bull Run gets known as the first Manassas or the first Bull Run. Interesting historical war geek fact for you. I'm going to geek up the factor loads today, even though I've only got 15 minutes to do this battle in, because that's as long as my YouTube account can cope with. That's right, my own YouTube channel. The South called it Manassas. The North, we should call those the Confederacy and the Union from now on. The Confederacy tended to name their battles after the nearest railway junction. The North tended to name their battles after the nearest water, sort of stream or river. So that's why you have different names for the same battle, but it is very much the same battle. Takes place 1861. In July, I think it was the 21st of July, it was indeed. That's not really that important, but not long after the outbreak of war in April at Fort Sumter. The location of this battle, this is a Ken Burns still, gotta love them. There's Washington there, bizarrely, for a twist of fate, remarkably close to Richmond. It's only about 100 miles between the two capitals of the Union and the Confederacy, and you'll see just how close Manassas is to Washington. It's about 20 miles to the west of Washington. So a Confederate victory here could threaten the Union capital. However, neither army was really ready for what was going on at all. There were a bunch of jokes at this time. The Union, his army is called the Army of the Potomac. That's the name of the river. They all name their armies after rivers as well. That's General McDowell, Irving McDowell. He's going to be the first of many in a long line of fairly useless Union commanders. On the Confederate side, we've got a few more people to give you an intro to. This is Beauregard, same bloke who ordered the shots fired on Fort Sumter. This is Joseph E. Johnston. And this guy down here, we're going to come to know him. At the time, he's called General Jackson. He's going to be given a very famous nickname by the end of this battle. I will always give you numbers probably when we talk about these battles, but depending on who you look at, you're always going to get different figures. McDowell's got somewhere over 30,000, maybe he's got about 34,000 men. The Confederate armies were split into different chunks. So Johnson had about 11,000 men, Beauregard had about 20,000 men. Jackson is one of those guys commanding under Beauregard at the battle. That's the setup for it. If we give you the context of the battle, this is always really important for you guys, as much as we always love to know exactly who moved where on the day. I know you girls love it, and which armies were doing what at the time. It's all about really what happened before and what happened afterwards in terms of writing your essay on the Civil War. This is the first major battle. There'd been very little fighting before there. There'd been some skirmishes in West Virginia up here. There'd been some skirmishes over in Missouri, but nothing on the scale of this, and it's still going to be a very small battle in terms of the overall pattern of the Civil War. But there was a suggestion that there was pressure on the home front to get on with it and do some fighting. You know, we've signed up, we've got a war, Sumter's been attacked, and there's a huge degree of confidence on both sides actually as well. Often is the way. Think about those Brits leapfrogging down to the recruiting office and playing tiddlywinks in the queue in 1914. On both sides, the best example of this is a newspaper editor who you should have met before, you definitely will meet again, a guy called Horace Greeley. He's the editor of the New York Tribune. He kept publishing in his paper the phrase, "on to Richmond," and it became a very famous phrase in the Union. Let's get it over with, let's get it done with, let's go and crush this rebellion and show the Confederates who the bosses are out there. And so both armies are sort of pushed together in an inevitable conflict, and it was always going to be in this area here. This is the area of Northern Virginia. The majority of the fighting we're going to talk about is going to take place in this area up here, because that's the focal point of the war in what we call the Eastern Theatre. The Eastern Theatre of war. There is going to be stuff about the Western Theatre as well, but this is going to be the focal point, and this is going to be the first major clash. So let's give one tiny more bit of context you should know as well. So Beauregard leads the main force there. Johnston is arriving, and he's arriving by train, but he's not going to be there at the start of the battle. Just a good example of showing you how important railways were in the Civil War, right at the start. So, onto the course of the battle. I'm going to geek it up a little bit for you here. Whenever we do the maps, we'll put the Confederacy in red, we'll put the Union in blue, it keeps it nice and simple. The original defensive line of the Confederates was drawn up along here, expecting the Union Army to come down from Washington. We're overly geeking it here for you, but why not? So McDowell sounded like a good plan. He ordered a flanking march around the top, around the left flank of the Confederate Army. If you've watched your Gettysburg, you should know all about flanks by now. And so the Confederates had to quickly reorganise, and they drew up on the defensive along this hill here. It was called Henry Hill, named after the family home of the Henry family, just here, where 84-year-old Mrs. Henry refused to leave her house during the battle, even though you had a Confederate army drawn up here and a Union army drawn up here. And the story of the battle is a very, very simple one, and we're going to do it very quickly. During the early part of the day, Beauregard's men are drawn up in a defensive line. McDowell sends his Union forces in, this way across Henry Hill, and they push back the Confederate army. That's stage one, if you like, of the battle. Stage one, the Confederacy were pushed back. And poor old Mrs. Henry, 84 years old, was killed by a stray shell that flew through the window of her house and hit stone dead by the shell. So she didn't survive the end of the battle, and it didn't look like the Confederates were going to survive at all. Until the introduction of this gentleman over here, this guy here. That was the unit led by Thomas Jackson, who was a Virginian. He was actually the commandant at the Virginia Military Institute when the war broke out, and a graduate of West Point, and he led a rallying defence of the Confederates, and his Virginians stayed strong in the face of this Union advance. They were the only ones who didn't retreat, and the legend has it that there was another general whose men were fleeing, and he was fantastically named Barnard Bee. General Barnard Bee, who said to his troops, "Look at Jackson standing like a stone wall." Standing like a stone wall. And the Confederates rallied. This is stage two of the battle. The Confederates rallied, they stopped retreating, and they held the line firm. And in these types of battles, if you've seen Gettysburg, again, you'll know this, if you could stand in a line and take the punishment and fire back, it was really whoever could take it the longest tended to win these fights. And so the Confederacy stopped the Union Army, stone dead, midway across Henry Hill. And once this is happening, you can see stage three of the battle. Down here, coming directly from the railway. This is the real word. Johnston's army detrained onto the battlefield. They literally got off Manassas Junction, straight off the train, walked onto the battlefield, and his reinforcement came in at the crucial time, just as the Union attack was breaking. And so you had the entry of Johnston, and this leads to a calamitous rout of the Union forces. So you could call that stage four if you like. Stage four, effectively, the Union troops run away. And here you can see them turning tail and running, back to Washington, getting out of Dodge as soon as they can. And the Confederacy have won the day and hold the field at the end of the day. It's around about this time in the Union rout, as the Confederates march forward and follow up their successful defence of Henry Hill, that they issue for the first time something that becomes very, very famous. It's known as the Rebel Yell. And hopefully, if this works, hopefully, maybe not, we'll get for you the Rebel Yell. And this is what it sounded like. The noise. you go. That was a noise being made by Confederate veterans, replicating the sound that they ushered forth from their lips as they charged across the battlefield and advanced. And this becomes something synonymous with Confederate victory and the tenacity and ferocity of Confederate troops. One Union man described it in the following way: "There is nothing like it this side of the infernal region." Nothing like it this side of the infernal region. That's what a Union veteran said about hearing the rebel yell. It terrified you, sent a tingle all the way down your spine, and when Union troops fell, that had a massive psychological impact on them for the rest of the war. So we move into analysis of who won and why they won. Well, clearly you can see, despite their disadvantages in resources that we looked at before, it was very clearly a Confederate victory. In terms of your casualty figures, looking somewhere in the region, and don't worry too much about these, there are a couple of battles where I'll make you remember them, but we won't always know them. You will see how small these are when you look at the other battles. It's about 2,800 Union casualties. And when we talk about casualties, we talk about dead, wounded, and missing, and the missing includes the captured. So loads of those were captured in the rout. About 1,200 of those were captured in the rout and then running away. The Confederates tended to be relatively similar in Civil War battles. They're all using the same weapons. They're standing very close to each other, firing bullets into each other's ranks. So you don't tend to get many battles where there's a big discrepancy. About 2,000 Confederate casualties. It's more about who holds the field at the end of the day. Often at this time in warfare, that was very, very definitely the Confederates. Why did they win? Well, you can certainly talk about the arrival of Johnston, but most importantly, you would probably talk about the role of the soon-to-be Virginian legend Stonewall Jackson, who becomes a hero of the South and typifies just how valuable he is to the Southern cause in this first major battle. So, the aftermath, the impact, the significance of the battle. Have we got time to wrap through and finish this off? That's not supposed to happen. That's not supposed to happen either. All that. Very smooth so far. Okay, so from this point on, you could talk about the psychological impact. Definitely. For the Union troops, don't forget that the Southerners backed themselves as the better troops with a martial culture and felt they would be, because they spent time outdoors, riding, shooting, hunting, whereas lots of Northerners were greasy mechanics or clerks, office clerks stuck behind desks, that the Southerners were going to be superior on the battlefield. This confirms that belief in Southern superiority. And you are going to see this repeated time and again, particularly in the Eastern Theatre, particularly in the first 2 years of the war, where Southern victories are going to compound the idea that they were just better men on the battlefield than the Union troops. And it's going to be very difficult for the Union to break that rut. Secondly, you could talk about the significance of this. Could it have led to a Confederate victory? A follow-up. Taking Washington. You will find historians who will moan at the Confederates, say they missed an opportunity here to take Washington on that day because the Union Army was so disorganised, so panicked in their fleeing back to Washington that a Confederate force could have just marched into the capital and you probably could have ended the war there and then and won their independence. There are historians who will disagree with that. Go read your Macpherson. Two reasons why they disagree. One, there was actually an organised Union force in between the Confederate Army and Washington. So winning Manassas didn't leave the road quite as open as many people thought. Number two, in winning the battle, the Confederate troops were actually as disorganised as the Union troops were themselves. So they would not have had the chance. Don't forget, they'd not fought a major battle before. No one really knew what they were doing. So it's unfair to criticise the Confederates. We'll come back again for a bit more analysis on the aftermath very shortly.